Chai Vasarhelyi and Jimmy Chin have explored the mentality of risk takers over several films. They won an Oscar for Free Solo. Their latest is called Wildlife. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. The new documentary Wildlife tells the love story of two people who moved from the clothing business into conservation. Doug Tompkins created the brand North Face. Christine Tompkins was CEO of Patagonia. They met in midlife when they'd each reached career peaks and were ready for the next chapter. They joined forces on a project to buy over 10 million acres of wilderness in Chile and Argentina and turn the land into national parks. While pursuing that dream, Doug Tompkins died in 2015. In the film, Kris explains her state of mind.
I lost the love of my life. I was seriously wounded on my knees. I get a note from a friend who says, "You have to make a choice and you have to make it right now. You can live off this story. You can tell everybody about this life you had and mourn Doug for the rest of your life. Or you can go to work and don't stop. What are you gonna do?" And that was a choice.
Wildlife follows Kris as she pushes forward on what became the largest national park donation in history. The film brings us into their circle that includes Yvonne Chenard, the founder of Patagonia, who hired Kris. Yvonne and Doug started out as vagabond climbers before they became entrepreneurs. This is apt subject matter for Chai Vasarhelyi and Jimmy Chin. When they met, they each had rising careers. Chai had made several films in Africa, including Yusu Ndur, I Bring What I Love. Jimmy was a prominent adventure photographer. As a team, they made Free Solo, about the climber Alex Honnold, as he tries to ascend the mountain face of El Capitan without ropes. Their next film was The Rescue, about the divers who saved a group of boys in Thailand trapped in a flooded cave. I interviewed Chai and Jimmy in Copenhagen at the CPH Docs Festival in front of a live audience. We talk about wildlife and what it means to document high-risk situations. Before we get to those topics, the conversation begins with their first collaboration, Meru. That film chronicles a harrowing expedition that Jimmy undertook with two friends, his mentor Conrad Anker and Renan Ozturk. The trio were climbing Mount Meru in the Himalayas. It's a peak that requires climbers to master several disciplines: high-altitude climbing, ice climbing, snow climbing, and big wall climbing, all in the same trip. No one had achieved it in over 25 expeditions. Jimmy filmed their trip, but was stuck on how to shape its narrative until he met Chai. I asked them to describe the making of Meru. We start with Jimmy.
We went there in 2008 and failed spectacularly about 100 meters from the summit after 19 days on the route, and then we went back in 2011 and tried it again successfully. But the film is really about friendship and loyalty and mentorship and these ideas that are a part of the climbing world that I didn't feel like very many people knew about or understood, and I wanted to bring those ideas to a general audience. And Chai, significantly brought so much to the film and made it into what it is today.
So, Chai, when you finally responded to Jimmy and watched his cut, what did you see in it?
I mean, it was astonishing because this had been like, we had experienced the DSLR revolution where for the first time we had good enough cameras that were small. And so the footage is basically Jimmy filming his two best friends and Renan filming they're all just filming each other. And they are on this outrageous climb where, sleeping on a portaledge, which is like a cot attached to a mountain that's, this wide. And just seeing the world through Jimmy's lens was astonishing, and it was inspiring, and just understanding this very deep connection to the outside world, and also kind of the first time I had access as a viewer to these incredibly remote places in such a visceral way. And then, there's also like the crazy factor. Like this, it seems entirely insane when you're looking at the dailies that, you guys are up there, for that long. And, it became a question of Jimmy and I began kind of falling in love in this process. And it was twofold. One, but the main thing for me was like, I loved Jimmy and was falling in love, and I wanted to help him tell the absolute best version of his story. And that's what motivated me. And it was kind of like a muscle that I had developed over, 4 quite obscure films about Africa, over, a 10-year career. And it was exciting. And just the question was, would these mountain climbers, because in climbing, everything is understated. We call it sandbagging. I had never been on a climb before. I never will really go on a climb. And so I was completely on the outside. But when you asked, Jimmy, like, was it hard? It's okay. It's very, very understated. So the question was whether these 3 mountain climbers would show up emotionally. And I think there was a magic in the idea that Jimmy and I were becoming, like, permanently attached, like probably getting married, having a child, that like Conrad and Renan really showed up. Like I remember Conrad like sat for a 7-hour interview. He cried. It all came, and so then we knew that you had it. You had the movie because they were able to reflect and speak in a way that civilians could understand.
I think this has become a notable characteristic of your last several films, Free Solo, The Rescue, Wildlife, where you're telling the stories of people who belong to a specific subculture where they can speak in a shorthand to each other, but have a stoicism to them that isn't, turning on a faucet of emotion. Jimmy, I wonder if you can describe from your perspective, what Chai was able to draw out in that process that might not have been there in your original cut.
Sure. I think Meru was the perfect case or film for us to work on because I think through that process we quickly discovered, the benefits of having 2 very different people with very different perspectives work on a film.
Which I assume just goes totally smooth.
Well, it's best when we can work out our issues on stage with
Yes.
a really smart moderator.
Yeah,
So
trying to figure out what we're going to do with the kids on any particular day. It's very smooth. The classic case, as I mentioned, is Meru, because this is a film that was deeply personal for me, that I was very, very close to, that I had particular insights into because I experienced it myself. And that brings, a certain level of understanding of the material. And, I always knew what I wanted people to feel. But I wasn't sure how to achieve it. But I had that clear idea of how I wanted people to feel and what I wanted people to get out of it. And then Chai, who, like she mentioned, is not an alpine climber or climb at altitude, but she brings a objectivity to the material that I don't have. And I think that's played out in all of our films. Chai's mind for narrative structure, and to be able to kind of, especially in the edit, go at it with a scalpel in a way that I can't, especially in like in Free Solo, where I remember how many days it took to shoot a particular shot. And how difficult it was and how much time it took to set up, and I'm just deeply married to a shot, and Chai will just look at it and be like, it's gone. It doesn't move the narrative forward. And I'm like, no, but we that sunrise shot is like one of our best shots. And she's just like, and we've learned to really trust each other's instincts in that way, where, you know, also in the rescue, I think the divers felt like maybe we understood them a bit better because we work with people like Alex and Conrad and Renan, and they were able to open it up a bit more. And I think having a little bit of credibility as a professional athlete, you know, allowed them to kind of feel like I might understand them a bit more. And that gave us and Chai access to kind of go in there and really mine these guys and their emotions when they're like the least emotional guys you've ever met.
In wildlife, we enter another insular circle of friends. I asked Jimmy how he first got to know Doug and Kris Tompkins.
Let's see, I was introduced to Kris and Doug Tompkins through my good friend Rick Ridgway, who was, you know, he was kind of a legendary explorer himself. He was the first American to climb K2 without supplemental oxygen, 1978. He was on the cover of National Geographic. He's written 9 books. He invited me on my first National Geographic expedition. And he was really good friends with Yvon Chouinard, who is the founder of Patagonia, but was also, in my circles, known as an incredible climber who'd done first ascents on El Capitan and on mountain ranges all around the world. So I knew of him first as a climber, an ice climber, and then second as an entrepreneur. And that friend group was also friends with Doug Tompkins and Kris Tompkins. Doug had founded the North Face and later on Esprit, and Kris Tompkins was the founding CEO of Patagonia. And this friend group, who is, they're incredibly private, but they had kind of, you know, defined an era and a lifestyle that I had kind of aspired to when I was growing up as a climber and skier. They were kind of the original climbing bums and ski bums. They kind of had this ethos of, you know, committing deeply to this craft of living in the mountains, being surfers and living in the outdoors. So they were icons to me, and I learned a bit more about their story working on another film called 180 South, and was just really, really moved by their life story, but also what they represented and also what they had chosen to do with their lives.
So Chai, this is a multi-layered film. It's a love story. There's also, you know, the story of what it takes to transfer this land that that Doug and Kris Tompkins bought and accumulated, and fulfill this mission that that Doug Tompkins had to turn it over to the countries of Chile and Argentina for national parks. When we spoke at the film's international premiere on Sunday night, you talked about this as being an incredibly daunting project to take on because you're making a film about mentors and friends of Jimmy, and these are people who have a history of building companies and being in charge of things, and now you're trying to tell their story. I mean, can you talk about what some of the challenges were at the outset to taking on this project?
Yes. So, Tom, basically our process is I don't want to make a film, period. I never want to make a film, and I dread making a film, and I dread making a film, and you keep on saying no, 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 until you have to say yes, until it's so meaningful that you absolutely have to say yes. So this was very much the story with this film, where it was like the worst idea. I was like, we're not going to make a film about your mentors. I'm not going to walk into that snake pit of like that trap where like I'd either make Jimmy mad, I'd make them mad, I'd hurt our reputations as being, we're pretty like, I don't want to say like objective filmmakers, even though like films aren't objective, but you know what I mean. We approach it warts and all. And then Doug died, and there was.
Which was in 2015.
Yeah,
to put it in perspective.
Was in 2015, and and also just to give you more perspective, like Rick spoke at our wedding, like that's Rick Ridgway, who's in the film, spoke at our wedding, like it was very close, and then Doug died, and I began to hear kind of the story of Christine Tompkins, who as a widow was faced with a choice, like she was either kind of going to die with Doug because that was the love of her life, or find the strength to pick it up. And I was really moved by this story of second chances and, reinventing yourself. And Kris and Doug were a really good example of that because, Doug, at the height of his commercial powers, when he had Esprit, which is a major global brand, decided to sell his stake and move to Chile because he wanted to find more meaning in his life. And that's when he hatched this dream of creating these national parks. And Kris, who'd been running, Patagonia, which arguably is like one of the single most successful clothing brands out there, since she was in her early 20s, and she was the first CEO, built it to be a $200 million company at the time, which is like 90s, which was very, very good. It's now $3 billion. Realized that she too wasn't finished, and found, love, like the love of her life in her late 40s, and found this purpose. So it just, I think that we're faced, climate change is the existential, question and crisis of our time. I look at our kids and see the fear in our 9-year-old's eyes, and I was like, this is a film that we probably would inspire people. And, I think it was really nice to make a film where there's a woman at the center of it. And I feel like that's kind of she was the woman behind Yvonne Chouinard at Patagonia. She was the woman behind Doug as they're making these parks. But then ultimately she finds her voice and affects this monumental change. They ended up, as of today, they've conserved 17 million acres. Oh, really? I thought they had in the new park now. Yeah, 15 million acres. Can't keep track of the acres. So yes, I dreaded every single minute, dreaded showing them, and they were this is a generation, they're older than we are. Yvonne is 84, Kris is 78, and they're used to being in charge. They're a privately owned company, they're used to getting their way, they're very, very thoughtful and intentional about their lives, and so here we come, asking for every single, Doug and Kris took tons of photographs. So there were a lot of intimate photographs in that collection. There was a lot of personal stuff. And the diaries, 24 years of diaries, which were pages and pages. And so it was tricky. But I think, again, it was always this idea that if you could give yourself over to telling the story the right way, it could really inspire people.
You described the challenge that you face going into this project of how do you pull their story out of them in a way that you want to tell it that's not necessarily, being their stenographer. Can you, give an example of something along the way where, you had to massage that to get something you wanted?
I've got a really good example. So it's just kind of in our DNA or our ethos of how we make films is I'm not willing to stop. And Jimmy's kind of a similar way. Is why are we making this film unless we give everything to it and try our hardest to make it the best it possibly can be, stretch the material until it's its limit. And I don't know, coming off of Free Solo and The Rescue, I was like, we will clearly get Yvonne's wife to speak in the film. And Jimmy kept on being like, you'll never get Yvonne's wife to speak in the film. She doesn't go on camera. She's not, she's incredibly shy. She appears in the film. You don't know it's her. And, there are concerns, there were kidnapping concerns. There were, she had concerns about being recognized. And, to add to that, Rick Ridgway's wife, Jennifer Ridgway, passed. And she was kind of our link to access with Melinda, and you needed these women's voices around Kris because it couldn't just be the dudes talking about her. So I just, in total me fashion, was determined. I never thought I would lose this battle. I was like, it's gonna happen, it's gonna happen. She appears in the film now, but it's only her voice. I mean, I still can't get over the fact that I didn't win, you know? Like, and it was critical. So we found a middle ground. It does seem like she's died, but she's still well alive. And she did sit for the interview, and it was like very much like, I don't know, last few weeks of editing that we got it. So it was that. I mean,
Well, I would say as a viewer that I wasn't even conscious of her not being on screen because she's a presence. I mean, you know, she has some important moments where she's contributing a perspective that's a unique, important perspective.
thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to put it into context, Chai's relentlessness. For the rescue, we needed the footage of the Thai Navy SEALs in the cave doing the rescue. We asked them probably 50 times, and they said no 50 times. And then Chai flew to Thailand. This is during COVID. As soon as they opened up Thailand for travel, Chai spent a week in quarantine.
10 days.
Oh yeah, 10 days in quarantine.
Dry quarantine. They don't tell you that until you're there.
It was on the beach, but anyways.
Couldn't leave the hotel room. What are you talking about? I was friends with the snails.
So she flies to Thailand, spends 10 days in a dry quarantine, and goes and convinces the wife of the admiral of the Thai Navy SEALs to give us this footage, which they had refused over the course of like a year and a half. And then they flew with a military attaché carrying a briefcase with the drives to New York for us to edit. So she convinced the Thai Navy SEAL, the admiral of the Thai Navy SEALs, to give us this classified footage, and she couldn't get Melinda to get on camera, so. But she tried.
Chai, if we scroll back to before you met Jimmy, there probably wouldn't be much in the trajectory of your career that would suggest you were going to go on to direct these kinds of adventure films. I wonder, you know, in these past 10 years or so of being in that world, you know, what you've observed of it, or what the kind of fulfillment that you found in telling these stories.
Well, again, it's like we're so different. So for me, it's been very fulfilling to have this wonderful material with which you can access this kind of elusive human potential, right? And again, like warts and all, like, you know, in Free Solo, it's about, you know, Alex wanted to had this audacious dream to climb El Capitan without a rope. But what was scarier for him was to talk to other people. And so then suddenly, like in the film, like he ends up falling in love and actually evolving emotionally, which has very little to do with his climb itself. And so, you know, so they're adventure films, but I think they're just also like lenses to look at this fascinating edge that is pretty like hopeful too, in that most of these stories we tell are about people who dare to dream, and with determination and grit and a little help from their friends, you know, fulfill, like, you know, make their dream, succeed and achieve their dreams. But, you know, just to like really pull back the curtain a bit about this is like, still Jimmy's like, you don't understand. Like I have had this 10-year or 12-year like examination and living with these guys, you know, adopting Alex Honnold to be like my third child, you know, and still, like, when we're making a film like this, he's like, you just don't understand. And so I'm always like, well, then tell me, but I think I do understand now.
As an outsider to this world, you know, the thing that strikes me most prominently is the risk factor. You know, all athleticism carries risks of injury, but the risk factor here, as you've documented in your films, you know, people perish. You've had near-death experiences, Jimmy. It's at a different level here than in most athletics. And you know, today, as we see, you know, human traffic jams on Mount Everest during climbing season, the I'm struck by the tension between the fact that this is maybe now this lifestyle is more democratized, more people can do it, but there's something unsettling about watching more people do it. And I wonder if you can reflect on those tensions from the inside.
Well, certainly there's a difference between people who can or have the experience to assess risk for themselves, and then the people who are being guided who might not be able to assess the risk for themselves accurately. So much of what we do is based on risk assessment, and you build that capacity to assess risk over time and experience, and it takes a huge amount of commitment. And at the very upper tiers of any of these sports where you're riding right on the edge and the stakes are extraordinarily high, your capacity to assess risk has to be very, very accurate. And there are miscalculations. But when it's been popularized and it's become much more commercial, the weight of that assessment lands on the guide services, on something like Mount Everest. And Mount Everest is really an anomaly, although there are actually much more guided trips on 8,000 meter peaks than there were 10 years ago, so that's changed a bit. But Mount Everest, for a long time, and still to a degree, is this mountain where all of these people who don't have a lot of experience climbing and the mountains and don't have the ability to assess risk are leaning entirely on their guides. And so a lot of that responsibility lands on these guide services. Now, the level of guiding abilities also varies. So there's a big mixture of what's happening on these mountains. I can't say, I can't make major generalizations just because every guide service is so different down to the individual guides, but it's certainly become, more of an issue on Everest because there is actually traffic jams and it's causing people to die on the mountains. But I also think, for myself, who am I to say, oh, you can't have that dream of climbing Mount Everest, because it's such a personal decision. But, I do feel like if you do have that dream, you need to pay some dues so that you can have some sort of capacity to know what's safe and not safe. But yeah, it's a tricky question. Risk is obviously a very, what level of risk you're willing to accept is very, very personal.
Chai is an insider, outsider to this world. How do you look at risk?
There's an argument that could be made that between Meru, Free Solo, the rescue, and even wildlife, I've been trying to negotiate my feelings about risk and trying to understand as best I can, because we've committed to this life together. We have two wonderful kids. And I have to say, it was Rob Moss who once pointed out to me after seeing Meru, he said, Chai, you don't really believe Jimmy's ever gonna die. And I had, honestly, I can't believe that, right? I can't, because I can't give him that pressure, and I know what I signed up for. But it's hard, it's really, really hard. And so we recently had a very close friend who was a participant in one of our films die. And it was, she was perfect. She was the captain of the team. I would trust her any day with my kids. And I don't know, I'm having an active, wrestling match inside me. And we've been talking about these questions a lot, because I think you are more likely to die above 8,000 meters than you are under 8,000 meters. This is a risky endeavor. And even if you're the best, but I'm not one to say you can't, because this is why certain individuals, this is what they live for. And we've spent this time looking at that question. So yes, I'm different.
Perhaps the way to describe it is a risk-reward equation, and for some of us, we mainly see the risk, and if, for those of us who have never experienced the reward, it can feel more abstract, perhaps, than the people who have experienced the rewards.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I mean, I think one of my favorite quotes from a good friend, a mentor, John Krakauer, said to me early in my career, there are two great risks in life: risking too much and risking too little. And, I think we all examine what it means to risk too much. And there's a lot of fear-based decision-making in life. But also, I guess the suggestion is that you have to look at what you're risking if you don't take risks. Like what do you lose? What is the, opportunity cost of not taking risks in life? And, we make those calculations all the time, whether you're an artist or a musician or scientist, or in any field. People take risks to progress. And whether that's in their craft or personally, but it's something that I think people who do what I do examine daily, and you have to be so deeply intentional about what you're doing every day when the stakes are that high. And part of that is the draw of living a life that way, because you are examining the questions that most people avoid examining. Nobody wants to believe in their own mortality, but when you look at your mortality every single day, you start to make certain types of choices, which I think for me is a really important perspective.
I want to thank Chai Vasarhelyi and Jimmy Chin for speaking with me, and thanks to CPH Docs for hosting our conversation. Wildlife is opening in theaters and will start streaming on May 25th. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Rafaela Nehausen. I'm Thom Powers. I hope you'll follow our Instagram at Pure Nonfiction. You can read our show notes and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.